And it is on.
All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Queer Studies Why Do History and Theory video and PowerPoint, and starting with what are the uses of history and theory, about halfway through the PowerPoint. So what are the uses in history of theory? Well, I suppose it depends on who you ask, but if you ask me, the uses of history and theory are to apply to our daily lives, our real lives. So what are our real lives all about? Our real lives are combinations of where we actually live our lives. So where do we live our lives? We live our lives in cities. We live our lives in the country, in the woods. We live our lives in our minds, and we live our lives in thinking about the past, and we live our lives in thinking about the present. So these are some of the places that some of the slides I used have to do with where I live my life, and where friends of mine live their lives and what they care about. And these are some of the things and the places and the people that I care about as well. So for me, history and theory are living things. And, Boston is a place that I care about. And so that's the Citgo sign on the left, and an area that I care about and a city that I care about. And in the middle there is a place and a being that a friend of mine who I care about also cares about very much. And I care very much about the past. The past to me, the picture of the Nabatean idol or grave marker, we don't actually know who it was, but the Nabatean situation around the 1st century BC to 1st century AD in what is now Jordan is a civilization that's always really intrigued me. And the distant past is something that's always fascinated me, and the mystery of the past and the uses of history and the theory about it, always something that's very intriguing to me. And then the view of London from Greenwich, from the Observatory of Greenwich, one of my favorite cities and one of my favorite views of London over the Thames. And I was lucky enough to be there fairly recently. And that's not my picture, but I stood there and looked at that view. And so to me, history and theory are very alive, and they are present. They stretch into the future, not just the past. And we use history and we use theory, or at least I do, to make my own life better, to make the lives of people I care about and the people I don't know better, and to hopefully make community connections and the planet better, and the lives that we live and are able to live for everybody better. So that's why I base the course around history and theory and structures and institutions and connections and community. And that is where we're going to go with the issue of queer studies and reaching out and reaching to each other to make all of our lives better, not just our individual lives, but thinking about others first, service, resources, reaching to each other and reaching to the planet. Okay, next slide, please. So how did this all get started? So the idea of doing history differently, remember I said started with Michel Foucault, and some of the specific fields that got it started: Joan Wallach Scott, gender and the politics of history, gender and culture, women's studies, feminist studies. This was really the beginning of starting to think about history differently. And these specific fields, again, women's studies, feminist studies, came out of, and then Black studies, African American studies, peace studies, all of these different studies started to come out after the civil rights movements, the women's movement, The gay movement all happened in 1969, 1970, 1971, and then the academic field started to emerge in the late 70s, early 80s. So this was the place where the idea of gender studies, women's studies, first started to look differently at history. I'll take the next slide, please. This historian, very important, died very young of AIDS, but started to look at history in a different way. One of the first to write a queer narrative history with an overlay of theory. Again, the idea of conceptual history and taking a look at everything from the church to marriage, to education, to religion, in the larger sense than the church, and wrote a very important book, several important books. This is one of my favorites, Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe. John Boswell, Yale or Princeton, sorry, I can't remember, but he, fantastic author. Again, this is a really lovely book, a really important book. And if you like narrative history with the theory absolutely tied to it, I highly recommend this book. And he talks about same-sex unions from the ancient period through the Middle Ages, through the early modern period, and it just will give you an absolutely solid basis for same-sex unions at a time where homosexuality was not yet a term, didn't get recognized, but certainly the practice was in place. And next slide. David Halperin, who we can read, I believe, is out of Michigan, University of Michigan or Michigan State. Again, I apologize for my lack of accuracy, but talks about how to do not only history, but queer history differently from the way some historians have done it. And one of the things that's very important in history is periodization. What dates you assign, what period names that you assign to periods. And David Halperin comes along and says, no, 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 you have to rename them. You can't call them ancient. You can't call it medieval. You can't call it Renaissance. You can't call it early modern. You can't call it modern, because in queer history, it's absolutely different. So there's a terrific article that I will assign. I won't make it, I haven't required it because it's not everybody's taste. But if you're interested in history, and if you're interested in queering history and making it fit a queer narrative as opposed to a patriarchal heteronormative narrative applied to queer history, read David Halperin, some fabulous books. He talks about Foucault and how deconstruction affected queer history. And then he talks about how to do gay history. Fabulous historian, and just telling you how you have to think completely differently, use language differently, use periodization differently, if you want to think about history of queerness and transness in the present. Fabulous stuff, absolutely fabulous. Next, please. So here's where we get to history in the present and in the past. We think of non-binary in the present, or people tend to think of non-binary as a current idea. It is not simply a current idea. It's been present with the Hijras of India for centuries. There are five genders in Sulawesi in Indonesia. There have been for centuries. In the Ottoman Empire, there are multiple genders. There have been, again, for centuries, and it is culturally accepted and culturally represented. And next slide, please. There are gender-neutral pronouns and language historically going back to 1386. If you look in Chaucer, in Canterbury Tales, he is gender neutral. They appears as a gender neutral pronoun in Chaucer, in Canterbury Tales, and then later on in other locations, in other materials in English, in Shakespeare as well, later on. So the current trend is anti-patriarchal. Again, it does not extend at the moment to academic writing, but it might be included. That might be a change. Next. So gender fluidity, we know from the 20th century, we're very familiar with it. From the 20s through the 50s, the flapper era, in terms of fashion, it certainly extended in Berlin, the Weimar Republic. There were other instances of it for different reasons. War is a great extender of gender neutrality for various reasons, for trauma reasons, for the lack of availability of men to work, for women moving into male roles. It happened here. It happened in Europe. It happened in China and Japan. It happened all over the globe, given the extent of the trauma of war in the 20th century. But it has happened in every war, in every century of human existence, where females, even in binary societies, took on male roles. So it is not new. The reasons might be newer in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it is certainly not new in the 21st century. And here are some great examples of women doing men's work in the 20th century in Europe. Okay, next. So again, this is just some quotes of 20th century in Europe, women doing men's work. I'm going to basically let anyone who wants to go back to the PowerPoint. I'm not going to take the time to read the slides. So we can go next. So in France, in the 20s, there was, of course, the idea, the left bank lesbians, the artists, the poets. Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas were the prime examples, but there was an entire cafe society of artists, writers, poets, photographers who were primary cultural and social. They were bookstore owners. They led the Paris social scene. They were out and about. They lived together. They were out in society. They ran the salons of Paris, and there was a major social scene that did have something to do with the, I want to say, lack of availability of males, but or the lack of not lack of availability, but lack of presence of males in the social scene. But it also had to do with the emergence of strong females in the social scene. Next. And there was a movement in France of revolutionary culture. There was the emergence of females into the work scene, the ambulance culture, the even women as a moral crusade in the First World War, the ambulance work, the nurses. And as women emerged into the public sphere for almost the first time, there was a general tendency of women to move into arts, culture, higher visibility. And with this, everything that had happened behind the scenes of women together, women in the arts, women writing to each other and keeping all of their talents hidden, all of those hidden talents moved into the forefront, and that became the emergent lesbian art scene, bar scene, and certainly romantic scene, romantic friendships, and lesbian scene, especially in Europe, but also in the music and art scene in the 20s in in both Black culture and white culture in the US as well. And everything, including pre-war gender roles, was affected and in some places accepted. Next. So the fact of women doing traditionally men's work affected everything from dress to fashion to manners to family relationships. Again, you had men away. And this is something that from ancient times to current times affects the roles of males and females in a binary society so that culture becomes more permissive. I talked about Petra in Jordan and Nabatean society in the 1st century BC, through the 1st century AD. And that was a nomadic culture that also built cities. It was a trading culture. And when the men were away trading, the women emerged and were able to do things like own property in their own name, trade in their own name, own camels, own property, do long distance trading in their own name, own slaves, be heads of families, etc., etc. So this is true from ancient times on. It was not true so much in Europe before the World Wars, but certainly in the interwar years and after, it became the case. Now, sometimes what happens is that and it certainly happened in the US in the 1950s, when the men come home from the war, when they demobilize, there's an expectation that the traditional culture patriarchal culture will return. And there's what we call a swing to the right. It usually doesn't last because there is a demand for those rights that those women have earned and have been able to accomplish in terms of work, in terms of political rights, in terms of social freedoms, to be able to return to those. And eventually that will happen. But typically, once women have been out of the house and into the workforce and into society, it's difficult in the same way that it's difficult for people of color to go back. It's difficult for anybody to go back. And the protections that have to be offered are legal protections, because as we see, what happens every time is that social values don't change, but legal protections are the first step. Okay, next. So here we have blurring traditional gender roles, working in factories, making everything from airplanes to tank parts, wearing traditional clothing that would be associated with males, more traditional clothing that would be associated with traditional haircuts that would be associated with males, and just even being out of the house, away from the children, out of the kitchen. So just to start there, that was a big deal. That was a big deal from the 19th century, a big change from the 19th century to the 20th century. Remember that in the 19th century, in the 18th century and the 19th century, you did have a move to the factories that did include some women industrialization, but there was still a largely patriarchal society in terms of work. The wars definitely included a move to make work that was traditionally considered men's work available. Women in factories were still doing what was often considered women's work. They were sewing, they were doing food preparation, they were doing fine work like painting. Once you get to the 20th century and you get the wars, you get women doing heavy industrial work, wearing more male-defined clothing, cutting their hair, smoking, living together away from children, that kind of thing. So once you get the extra added, what they call trauma work of the 20th century, you get more evidence women driving, women flying, eventually we're going to be flying planes. That's late 20th century, more 21st century. And eventually you get women in the military. Eventually you get women fighting. When they start, they are nurses and ambulance drivers. But you get more evidence that women are capable of doing all of these. And notice that the terms are still very binary. Okay, the terms are still men's work, women's work, but you get at this point women doing what is called men's work and dressing and cutting their hair like men to do men's work. Okay, next. So here's another thing. Gender roles blurred for males as well as for women, because males are injured and killed wholesale, and you get an entire class of invalid males who are dependent on others. When I first went to Europe to live in late 1968, there was still, everywhere you looked in every large European city, there were thousands of war veterans, amputees on the streets in wheelchairs, crutches, begging, just not taken care of by the social systems. There was a whole class of males dependent on females and on the government, and it was a huge problem for society as a whole. There was a class of single women, again, widows, single women, nurses, etc., wage earners, head of household, that created by the wars, World War I, World War II, which had never existed previously in Europe, and this becomes a permanent feature of society. So what does this mean for queer studies? You have men who are dependent or single. You have women who are working and single. They're all living away from home. They're all living in cities once they're demobbed or demobilized. So for the first time, they're all living together. They're away from the traditional family, which is asking them to marry, live together, usually with the family, and create more children, and not giving the opportunity for any kind of queer mating, socializing, and carrying on of a queer lifestyle. Now they're all of a sudden single. They're all living in cities with each other. And all of a sudden, there's an opportunity for a queer community to grow, to meet each other, to socialize. This is when the word queer comes to mean homosexual in Europe, in Britain especially, comes to be applied as a slur. Yes, it means other. Yes, it means different. Yes, it means weird, but it also comes to mean a male homosexual. That's queer, that's different, and it comes to mean a slur. But this is the first time that you have gangs and gangs and gangs of demobbed, meaning demobilized soldiers in the city by themselves, and then females too, workers, after World War II, female soldiers coming out and not going back to the farms, not going back to their families, but living single in the cities with each other, being able to say, I have a queer identity. I'm going to go live in the city with other same sex, same experience people who are like me, who then I'm going to socialize with and pursue this queer identity. So a lot of this comes not only to gender, but it comes to sex. And the 40s and 50s are the era of the butch femme. That's how you identify. This is when these laws come into effect. Homosexuality has been identified and started to be used as a term in Germany in the 1890s. Comes into play in terms of categorizing people in the early teens, 20s. It's allowed in the 20s. It's clamped down on by the 40s. So this all starts to gel. By the 50s, when the males are coming back from the war, the females are supposed to go back into the home. Everybody's saying, no, we're staying in the cities. And this is when gay culture really gets going. Okay, next slide. So again, here's this idea of transformation through social trauma. You get the females out of the home doing male work. You get the males and females being demobilized from the armies of the First World War, the Second World War, creating an urban culture. Once you have an urban culture, it's all over. You have gay culture, gay and trans culture, and you have it being public. You have everybody together in the city, because this is the disruption of heteronormative power, heteronormative gender roles. It all just falls apart because there are other possibilities now. Okay, next. So the idea is you focus on what's going on, not the later results that you get, but to focus on the ideas of what's happening in the moment. The effects of how the deconstruction of gender happened in the moment. And yes, there's a linear progress to it, but the idea that for this one book for Roberts, who talks about changes in the French gender roles, happened in the moment. It might have been a short-term process in the moment. In this one book, this author focuses on what the effects were in the moment, and maybe you don't focus on the queer history. This is sort of isolated event history. But we can always focus on the long term, but also remember that the idea is to look at what happened in the event as well. And excuse me, the event brought about changes and possibilities in the moment. So that's very important to remember too, because the events of changing gender roles in the moment allowed specific communities and specific people to survive. That's really important to remember, that if we look back in history, we can't just look at how the effects were for us, because that wasn't the intent at the moment. The intent at the moment was to survive, for everybody to survive. And if you look at that idea, that if we ease up on gender roles, if we allow this, 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 and this, it's actually going to create survival. That's actually a terrific lesson for the moment. The global ideas about long-term change, that's an afterthought, or even theory is an afterthought. But the fact that we could be so fluid, or that those people could be so fluid in the moment, is also a great lesson for history for the moment. Okay, next. Okay, so French society in particular, and why look at French society? French society is still very binary, very male, female. Females are very femme. Males tend to be very very masculine oriented, and it's a very binary society, and it's a stabilizing principle. The fact that of French society today, people are very recognizable. Clothing is very recognizable. Manners are very binary. If you spend any time there, they are very divided into males in public, females in private, et cetera, et cetera. If they are able to do this, to make this change in order to survive, and remember, the French were occupied in both World War I and World War II and taken over by a foreign power. So the idea is that, and we can go to the next slide. If they were able to do this, to make this change to survive, then in terms of method for this historian, this is probably a good lesson for other cultures. If the French were able to do this in this one small place, and if they were able to give up their really serious focus on binary male, female, power, public versus private hierarchical structures, then it probably is a construct, and it's not something that is absolutely necessary. And I can go into this more at some later time, but it makes sense from a historical analysis to do this, that if the French are so concentrated on binary hierarchical structures and they were able to give this up, it makes sense that other people in other cultures can also change this hierarchy. Okay, next. All right, so Joan Scott says the same thing, basically, that the question is, if gender and power construct each other, how do things change? And basically says that the answer is the same, that change can be initiated in many places, that political upheavals are one way of doing it, but that subtle changes, organizational changes, can also play a factor. And that, yes, one of the ways, war may be one of the ways, political change, legal change may be other ways, that there are many factors that might do it. You don't need a war to do it. Joan Scott recognized in her time when she was first writing in 1986 that legal change was another way to do it. The cultural shift is another. There are many ways to do it. In other words, you don't need a war. At the time of the Civil Rights Movement, as I said, legal change is another way to do it because it's going to be very difficult to change people's minds. So gender and power are a feature of society, are a feature of the organization of society. So the idea is, how do we think about changing it? And that's going to be one of our problems. It's one of our problems now. It's still one of our issues. How do we go about changing gender, the construct of gender and power? So that's actually going to be one of the questions of this class. So we're going to continue to look at that. And I'll take a look at the next slide. So to wrap up, why employ history and theory? We have new questions every generation, every era, seemingly every day. History and theory provide new context. They provide new questions. They provide new perspectives on ongoing questions. We still need to reform institutions and structures. We need to redefine the old questions in new terms. And history and theory can provide us with answers as to what we've done wrong and to what we've done right and to what we need to keep trying. So history and theory are going to be a source of answers, a source of new questions, and a source of information. And I hope that you will enjoy the journey that we take through history and theory in this class. And I think the next couple of slides are sources, and please take a look at those and you will find some interesting material in them. And feel free to contact me for more sources for the work you have to do. And I hope you've enjoyed this short presentation, and thanks very much for listening. I'll see you next time.